It's an enormous pleasure to welcome you all to this ABI inaugural professorial lecture. It's a very, very special occasion when an academic is awarded a professorship, and we really celebrate Thor's achievement. I met Thor, I think, 20 years ago. He can correct me if I'm wrong. I think I met him about 20 years ago when just after he finished his PhD at University of Western Australia in Perth. And I knew his supervisor, David Lloyd, and then I tracked his career when he went then about 10 years ago to Stanford, and I think I probably met you a couple of times at Stanford. I got invited there once to give a talk, and I remember meeting Thor then, and then he came, we managed to get him back here for a period visit, and I always knew that one day we'd really be able to get this guy to ABI. So it was an enormous triumph for us when we persuaded him in around 2011 to come back to a research position in ABI and a lectureship in engineering science. And he has really, really taken off since that time. He's built a very large group in the ABI, musculoskeletal or neuromusculoskeletal work. He has, that group has around 20 students, PhD and master's students, around 10 postdocs. It's one of the biggest groups in the ABI now. It covers everything from basic science to commercial outcomes, a number of commercial outcomes, which maybe we'll hear a little bit about, and of course lots of really, really sound clinical linkages. So it's a fantastic success story, I think, what Thor has achieved. So we're very, very pleased to have him in the ABI, and greatly look forward to this talk on Jack of all trades or a master. Thor.
Thank you very much, Peter, for those kind words. Thank you, everybody, for turning up. That's great. I'm pleased to be here and talking to you a little bit about my research over the last 20 years. Gosh, it's gone very fast. When you have to kind of think of this moment and look back on your career so far as a researcher, it was a bit of a challenge to really try and come up with something meaningful about who I am as a researcher, as a person, an individual. And after Andrew and Ian, it was a pretty hard ask to think about coming together with something that would be philosophical and interesting and outside of maybe my area of expertise and talk about something really interesting to everybody. So I decided not to do that and rather just talk about my research, because that's what I know best. Now, the title here, Jack of all trades and master of none, I had really considered myself to kind of fit in this mould, and as you'll hear, I had a bit of a windy or windy path, for those of you who actually read the abstract and didn't realise it was just another opportunity to have some free wine and beer and come along. In the abstract, I said you would find out a little bit more about my path, and one of the things when I look back is that I have had a very windy path into where I am, but ultimately being here and being part of bioengineering, I really feel at home, and that's one of the key take-home messages for me. So we'll talk a little bit about what it means to be a jack of all trades and master of none, and it could be myself, but I think it applies to really all facets of bioengineering. Okay, in doing a little bit of homework, I thought, well, let's look at science as a whole. This is the only part of the talk that's somewhat philosophical, the rest is just about my research. But it was kind of interesting. You go to Wikipedia and you see the branches of science, or the hierarchy of sciences, and you have the formal sciences of mathematics and logic, which kind of cross multiple disciplines. You have kind of physics and underlying understanding of the world we live in. Life sciences, which include functional biology, cellular biology, and all these things across multiple scales as well. So, and for those of you who have all seen Peter present on multiple occasions, he likes to show, of course, the scales that we have to work with, particularly in computational modelling. And of course, you go through to scales of astronomy and geoscience, which my sister kind of knows a bit more about than I do, as well as social sciences. sociology, psychology. So this is kind of an overwhelming array of different research and science that goes on today. But what's kind of interesting about this is that modern scholarship has really laid an inordinate emphasis on specialisation. And you hear this as a PhD student, what are you going to specialise in? What's your key thing? What do you want to make yourself known for? And of course, the outcome of that is that we see faculties and we see departments and we see people clustering together with the work that they do. And so we see this segmentation. And I kind of like this quote that's from this paper where disciplinary experts tend to regard fields other than their own with some considerable suspicion, spurious at worst, at best irrelevant. This is how I feel about the cardiac mechanics group, where obviously musculoskeletal research is far superior and important. We could debate that later on. But what's really challenging here, of course, and interesting, is this concept of having knowledge in other spheres of disciplines outside of our own. And this is what we often think of when we think of this term, a jack of all trades as a master of none. And when I started doing a bit of research for my own talk, I was pleasantly surprised to realise this is not the full quote. The full quote actually goes on to say, but oftentimes better than a master of one. So yes, I'm redeemed by being a jack of all trades, master of none, and it turns out that actually this is maybe a feature of myself and my research and who I am. And indeed, it's potentially a feature that brings us all together in this room, anyone who's interested in bioengineering. Because our faithful source of Wikipedia, that's where I go for all my research, when I'm doing my background reading, bioengineering is the application of principles of biology and the tools of engineering to create usable, tangible, economically viable products. So that touches nicely, I think, a segue from Ian's talk, which we had recently, and Andrew Cabinet's as well, on making life better and just making stuff. This is what engineering is all about. Another quote, bioengineering employs knowledge and expertise from a number of pure and applied sciences such as mass and heat transfer, kinetics, blah, 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 biomechanics, blah, 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 polymer science, thermodynamics. I had to teach that once. You get the picture, right? There's lots of things going on here. And another one from an interesting quote here, bioengineering has a broad base which applies engineering principles to an enormous range of size and complexities of systems. And these range from the molecular level to cellular, tissue-based systems to whole macroscopic organisms, and can even range to an entire ecosystem. The one part that was missing from this quote, which I've added, and this is Besier 2020, of which the application to the musculoskeletal system is without doubt the most important. So going back to this slide, when we think of science and all its disciplines, and we think of bioengineering, and where does bioengineering fit in all its disciplines? Well, bioengineering encompasses a bit of this and a bit of this and all of that. Maybe perhaps not astronomy yet, although there's work in Ian's lab, of course, going into space. So sure, we can tick that box too. Sociology, this is bioengineering. We, by default, by definition, bioengineering encompasses all these disciplines of science. And it's for this reason why I feel really at home at the Bioengineering Institute, because I'm a jack of all trades, master of none. However, supposedly I'm an expert in this field. That's why I'm here today, and that's why you're here listening to me. My children couldn't believe that they were going to sit through a whole hour of me talking, because usually when I start giving them lectures, they kind of get this glazed look on their eyes and they quickly run away and do something else. But kids, I'm sorry, you're going to have to bear with me for a bit. How on earth do we call ourselves the experts in the field? And I think the answer is, well, I don't think we are the experts in this field. We're still learning. And that's one of the things I think that I've really enjoyed in my career, is the fact that every day I'm learning stuff and I keep learning, and I think that's great. Okay, so it wasn't always like this. And actually, 500 years ago, Leonardo Da Vinci was considered, of course, one of the greatest painters of all time. I think everyone appreciates that. He was one of the most diversely talented individuals of all time. And he was a prolific inventor, he was a creative genius. And of course, he has contributions in lots of different fields. And this guy was amazing. Anatomy, physiology, civil engineering, geology, hydrodynamics, of course, biomechanics was a big feature there, particularly musculoskeletal biomechanics. You can see there's some bones and muscles and joints. He was a true bioengineer. A couple of other interesting points here about Leonardo. The first of which, he had no formal academic training. Kids, don't listen to that. The second of which, he did not publish his findings. All my PhD students, do not listen to that. Of course, he wrote these as notes and anecdotes. And of course, centuries later, we can appreciate the visionary for what he was. And things have changed, times have changed. Of course, multidisciplinary research is a thing. And I like this quote from Horwitz: interdisciplinary research is a linchpin of major scientific progress and innovation. And I think we all kind of have taken that Kool-Aid. We all believe what we're doing in interdisciplinary research is really making a difference, and it's important. So at this point of creating these slides, this was about 2 a.m. last night, and for those of you who know me, this is very uncharacteristic because I'm usually very organised, and I'm usually the first one to arrive for meetings. I'm never late. So it was quite uncharacteristic last night to be thinking about this, and I felt like I dug myself into a hole at this point, because here I am talking about Leonardo Da Vinci, and somehow I have to segue into Thor Besier, and I thought maybe that was too big a leap to make. But nonetheless, I'm not really going to draw parallels with my own work and that of Leonardo, but just to really make the point that 500 years ago, science was not something that you did in isolation in one point. It was actually much more broad than that. And there's something in that for us. Okay, another thing I'd just like to briefly mention is that there's a lot we know from science. There's been incredible breakthroughs in science in the past 500 years when Da Vinci was starting to investigate all of these phenomena. But there's one thing, and there's a final frontier, or next frontier, and this comes from Vijay Pandey, actually, who was at Stanford, still at Stanford, and I was listening to a podcast of his at about 2:30 in the morning, and what was really intriguing for me was, of course, things that a lot of people, again, in this room are aware of, is that biology is the next frontier. We don't understand a lot of what's going on in the human body. And these are relevant things that are happening to us today, obviously with pandemics, healthcare, climate change feeding the world. These are big issues, but they're issues that won't be resolved by individuals working in silos. They're contributions that need to be made with people from all different disciplines. So what's kind of key here is moving beyond discovery, the idea that you want to uncover the basic understanding, to an engineering approach where you could build biology, if you like, and that's a tipping point, and it's perhaps somewhat a scary tipping point as well for those who have read *Sapiens* or Noah Yuval Harari's work. He also believes that the next frontier is in engineering biology, but of course we're the people who are making this happen. It's super interesting, and it's not just the problem to solve, but the way to solve it. Something also that engineers have a certain approach to problem solving that's interesting when they apply it to biology. And just another quote, which I also found interesting. This was from about 2:45 in the morning, and I'm not sure if many people know this quote. What's probably more interesting is who said it. This is completely out of context, by the way, too, from what he said and what he was talking about. But as we know, there are known knowns. There are things we know we know. We also know there are known unknowns. That is to say, we know there are some things we do not know. But there are also unknown unknowns. The ones we don't know, we don't know. This is Donald Rumsfeld, believe it or not. This is a bit tongue-in-cheek. He actually wasn't predicting the challenges of understanding biology as we know it today, but I think it applies nicely. There's a whole lot of stuff we don't know that we don't know, right? So this is interesting from a scientific perspective. It's also interesting from an engineering biology perspective, because you really need to understand the system before you can engineer it and make it and do something about it. So here's the challenge, and I'd like to think that we're, in our group at least, discovering the known unknowns. Not necessarily, you uncover the unknown unknowns by doing the research, but so far looking at the known unknowns of the musculoskeletal system, and really what our goal is to develop computational models that can really explain and predict the form and function that exists in the musculoskeletal system, and the application of these models to various different applications, and these are broad, so basic understanding and knowledge, mechanobiology, which is really just biomechanics in reverse. It took me about 8 years to figure that out. Orthopedics, of course, and sports medicine. Okay, so my talk then, moving from the philosophical kind of stuff, going on to really what contributions our team have made, because it's a team effort here. There are kind of a few main things, and as we go through, there'll be some take-home messages, I hope, which will stick with you. But we'll talk about the role of biomechanical modelling for injury prevention. Traditionally, this is the medical domain, where it's trial and error, and we're trying to have an impact in the medical domain ultimately. There's challenges associated with translating our work into the clinic, but we're coming up with solutions. That's kind of what we're about. Now, in 1992, Van Mechelen came up with this model of injury prevention, and it said, first of all, you have to understand some kind of epidemiology that, is there a need to understand this injury, establish a mechanism, and then do some prevention and assess the effectiveness. And it's number two, really, where my interests lie, because to understand the mechanism of injury, we must first appreciate that musculoskeletal injuries have a mechanical etiology. So mechanics are involved, we need to understand that. And it's not just the acute loading on tissues, but potentially the load history on tissues. And I'll get to that in a minute, but this is an incredibly complex system, much more complex than cardiac mechanics. So there's lots more muscles than just one, right? I was fortunate enough to spend a good deal of time when I was at Stanford with Dennis Carter and Gary Beaupre, and for anyone interested, they essentially have written the Bible on skeletal function and form, and it was published in 2001 here. But really what's interesting about this quote from the book is that there's this gracefully efficient physical order that you see in the musculoskeletal system. And the existence of such hierarchy and structural and kinematic harmony exists from this unique and complex phylogenetic and ontogenetic history in which genes and mechanical forces play a critical role. And it's the mechanical forces, that's really of interest to us. And for decades, Dennis and Gary went about showing how the phenotype of tissue could be influenced by the mechanical environment. And this is really quite fascinating. Tendons, for example, that wrap around bone are mostly under kind of tensile load, but you can appreciate the area that they wrap around bone, suddenly you have some compressive load. So you can turn this somewhat fibrous tissue into maybe a fiber cartilage type tissue, or indeed it could turn into a bone if anyone's had a bone spur. So the tissue is responding to its mechanical environment. So what's really important then is to understand this mechanical environment, and for that we need computational models. So at this point, the clinicians out there start to get glazed eyes and go, whoa, stay with us, we're going to do some biomechanical modelling to understand tissue loads and show you how this can be useful in a clinic. You need a model to begin with. I finished, this is kind of where I segue a little bit and talk about my windy road into biomechanics. At the time, there was a spate of knee ligament injuries in sport, still is, and we didn't know much about them. So we decided, me and my colleagues, to come up with this model. Now the segue here, I should just kind of talk a little bit about this background. And I completed an undergraduate degree in physical education at the University of Otago. So I was there 92 to 95, and for my honours project, I wanted to go and look at lower back injuries in sailors. Don't ask me why I wanted to do that, because I've done a bit of sailing, but I was really more into windsurfing. But I thought this is a good excuse to get out and about. And I got some top class 470 sailors. We rigged them up in the lab and we measured EMG, and we said, oh, this is really cool, I want to understand injury biomechanics. My real love, of course, was windsurfing. At the end of my honours degree, my supervisor at the time was actually an Australian guy, and I said to him, look, where can I go if I want to do more study? I really like this stuff. I want to answer more research questions. And he said, look, Western Australia is a really good spot to go if you want to understand biomechanics. And at that point, I'm sold, because it just so happens Western Australia is also a mecca for windsurfing. So I get myself a postgraduate scholarship to go to the University of Western Australia. This is it. For those of you who don't know Perth, here's the city in the background. This is the Swan River. Here's the University of Western Australia. This is the Sport and Exercise Science Department. Conveniently, across the road is actually a pretty good windsurfing spot. So I then meet David Lloyd, and David had just arrived back from the States. He did a postdoc at the Rehab Institute of Chicago, and he said to me, "Thor, what are you interested in?" I said, "Windsurfing." And he said, "No, really, what are you interested in?" I said, "Yep, lower back injuries and windsurfing. It's a big problem. We've got to solve it." So I said, "All right." He took a deep breath and said, "Well, what about knee injuries and windsurfing?" "Oh yeah, they're probably number 2 to back injuries." "Okay, well let's do that, shall we?" All right, and then it was maybe a week later. "Well, why don't we just ditch that windsurfing thing? Are you interested in computational modelling?" And at this point, naively said, "Yes. I like maths and physics. I like that stuff." And he said, "Good." And so this was my first experience of computational modelling. Those of you might have fond memories of the Silicon Graphics 02, 66 megahertz, I believe, back in the day. I knew nothing about this stuff. And he said, "Right, here we go. Here's some code." So I had to teach myself. I was the self-taught engineer. I had to teach myself to write code. Interestingly, a couple of years ago at the midwinter function, there was a questionnaire that went around, and I felt slightly taken back by this. Those of you who voted on that might know something about it. And it said, which lecturer or researcher at the Institute is least likely to write code in Python using Linux? And of course, the answer came back, Thor Besier. And I was taken aback, firstly because I'd learnt to write code on this thing. I do write code. I can write code, not so much these days. Luckily, the second question was which researcher is most likely to finish an adventure race? The answer to that also was Thor Besier. So I thought, oh, that's okay. That's true. I did finish an adventure race. There are some take-home messages here. Number 1. Follow your passion and do something that interests you. There was a talk about the difference between passion and drive. But I was passionate, obviously, windsurfing. That was a bit of a harebrained idea. But it ended up taking me down a path in which I made some decisions which I thought, this is really of interest to me, and I want to do something, and I like sport, I like the injury kind of thing, and I really like biomechanics. And I think if you don't like it, it's not worth doing it. So that's just a fundamental take-home message. Research is all about resilience. Goodness knows how long it took me to open a file. It probably took me a lot longer than it should have. I/O and figuring out all the things I need to do to get this thing to work. But I got there in the end. And all of you doing PhDs know, and who've done PhDs, it's about resilience, not necessarily being book smart. What David taught me very early on, think about the mechanism and ask good research questions. And of course, that's a key message for anyone in research. You've got to ask research questions and good research questions to begin with. So this is what we did. We asked this research question. We developed a mechanism for knee ligament injuries. This was my PhD research. We said, look, here's a ligament. It's the anterior cruciate ligament. It's not going to rupture unless there's some sort of load that's placed on the ligament and the ligament breaks. That's fairly straightforward. Where it gets a bit hairy then is that the load placed on ligaments is due to the external loads, the forces that are supporting those loads, and the geometry and posture of the joint. So we did a whole bunch of research studies. We published some of this work with Jody was a student who I co-supervised. Alistair and John did some work on body posture and kinematics. And we basically said, hey, look, there's certain types of postures that lead to large loads that are putting the ACL at risk. The other thing we did was we tried to understand this beast over here, and this is central nervous system control. Thankfully now there are many more smart people in this room who are interested in the brain and how the brain is coordinating movement, and I think we're making some big pushes in that area. But one thing that we did with David, and there's some more recent work with Minka on joint geometry and understanding loads, but one thing we did was we published this work on EMG-driven models for muscle force. And it was pretty cool because I contacted David the other day, and we both realised that now that publication has over 1,000 citations, which is pretty cool for our area. We say, hey, look, we've made an impact. But what was actually more impactful potentially is that there's been 3,700 downloads of the code. So that's even better. Thankfully, the code's been rewritten since I first wrote it, because they'd be sending it back. The take-home message from this was sharing your models leads to greater impact than publishing them alone. So there's only a certain number of people out there who are going to read your models or your papers where you publish your models, but actually giving them out to the greater community has great more potential impact. Okay, so we did a bunch of this research. Along came Carolyn Finch. She was an epidemiologist, and we said, well, she knows nothing about mechanics and biology. And she said, but I'm interested in injury prevention on a larger scale. So we did this study with Australian football at the time. This is Aussie rules, for those of you who don't know. And we rolled out this intervention study. And after a couple of years, we had over 1,200 people in that study, and we showed a 20% reduction in knee ligament injuries based on some of the fundamental research we're finding out the mechanism of injury. So we thought that's pretty cool. And even though it was a relatively simple biomechanical model, it nonetheless gave us a framework that we could really understand the problem and address it and do something about it. So that was kind of the first papers that I published in this area, and that was quite interesting and useful, I think. What was fun was that FIFA then adopted this thing called the 11 Plus, and they rolled this out internationally. So FIFA, the World Football Federation, and there was a group of researchers in Norway who I met after the fact, who picked up on some of our research and said, let's integrate some of that research into larger scale programs to prevent injury. So I think we've had a real impact here on the real world. What is kind of interesting is it took 15 years for that impact to actually eventuate. Now, there's another take-home message here. This, forgive me for just walking through some boring data, children. I hope you're noticing. But what I'm showing you here is some results from these papers that we published, and we're seeing the knee joint moments which are in the kind of frontal plane, so whether you're going knock-kneed or bow-legged posture, and we're showing the magnitude and size of the loads if you do running side steps to different angles. This is a normal run, this is a crossover, so that's what the different colours mean, and this is various parts of the start space: weight acceptance, hip push-off, final push-off. The key take-home message here, you don't really need to understand any of this, is that these are means and standard deviations. Here's a cohort of 12 soccer players, actually in this cohort, and there's huge variation. Okay, that's all you need to know here, and this is common, right? You see this in the way that people do different tasks. You see large variation, and it turns out that group mean statistics hide interesting findings. Okay, if you have a group here and you do some measurements, and a group here do some measurements, well, you maybe don't see much of a difference. But within that group, of course, there's lots of interesting things going on. And a single intervention to this cohort may not be very effective. We need to pull out those individuals and say, who's having valgus moments, who's having varus moments? You know, they're quite different things. The other thing that is worth considering here is if you go down this path, the gold standard for statistical and study design is a randomized clinical trial. And it turns out that RCT, the randomized clinical trial, maybe isn't a good study design for personalized medicine. And we have to really think about that. I'm not very good at statistics. There are other people in the department who are much better at that. And the fourth thing I've already mentioned, that it took almost 15 years to have some sort of clinical impact from the basic research through to something being done. Okay, so it takes a long time to do that. Anyway, I've stolen these slides from Orion Healthcare because I really like it, and it's where we're at today. Population health management, let's call it evidence-based medicine, assumes that all patients in some cohort are the same. You give them an intervention, you see who responds, who doesn't respond. We need to move to precision medicine, data-driven healthcare, personalised medicine, whatever you want to call it, but understanding that everybody is unique. So this is the state of play, I guess, for us now. How do we do this? We need some sort of treatment strategy that's personalised. And we still don't have a complete solution for this, but this is our goal. This is where we're going towards. Just one last thing on injury prevention, and it's worth mentioning. So Van Mechelen this model here of epidemiology and testing out interventions was extended a bit by Carolyn Finch, who was our epidemiologist colleague in Australia. And she said it's important to understand the context of which you do interventions and evaluate the effectiveness in the implementation context. And so actually what this means is we need to, in order to have an effect on people, oftentimes these are behavioural issues. We need to get people to change their behaviours, and therefore we need people who understand behavioural psychology on our team. So we previously kind of poo-pooed Carolyn because she wasn't a biomechanist, but then we realised, well, the epidemiologist is adding a lot of value here. Maybe we should also go and talk to the behavioural psychologists in the room because they know all about behavioural change, and that's really what we want to do. That's the last I'm going to say about behavioural change because I don't know anything about it. Challenges to translating our biomechanical models. So, I've spent 20 years trying to make models, and some of them were successful, some not, most not. But there are three main challenges in order to get into the clinic. The first is creating these models, and everybody in this room who's made some sort of model will know it takes time and effort. This is the kind of standard workflow that we have, right? We generate some geometry from some medical imaging, we assess material properties, we do perhaps some dynamics or static kind of an assessment to understand the forces involved on the system. We get down to a tissue level and understand the stresses and strains. We create lots of pretty pictures. There's some people who take this further and go to kind of cellular or molecular level. Okay, so we can appreciate this takes time and effort. This is not going to happen in the clinic anytime soon, which is a problem. And there's another question here, how specific do we need to be? So, we do this often from literature values. Can we get subject-specific information from all of these different tissues? These are real problems that we're trying to address today. Okay, here's the next segue. I'd been in Western Australia for 7 years. I'd learnt a lot, but I felt like I needed to move on, and I think this is an important point for those of us who have been at the ABI. Yes, it is the best place to do bioengineering research in the world, but sometimes you have to leave the nest to know how good it was back inside the nest. So I left Western Australia, and it was a bit of a funny story because I'd written a grant, and it was a grant to the National Health and Medical Research Centre in Australia, NHMRC, and I said to them, I want to do patient-specific modelling of joint replacements, and I want to go to the Auckland Bioengineering Institute. So I wrote this grant, and I got some help. Peter might have helped me with a letter of support and said, yep, we're going to do this. And it's been 2 years at the ABI, then I'm going to go back to Western Australia. And I didn't get the grant. It was unfortunate. They said, I'm sorry, good application, but you didn't get it. But you're on the waiting list. Well, that means if no one else will take it, then I got it. So I said, okay, well, that one's done and dusted. So resilience kicks in. What else am I going to do? And at the time, I'd met someone, not in that way, Sonia, another research colleague at a conference, as you do, and they said, look, my research colleague is looking for someone with your skill set to do patient-specific modelling of patellofemoral pain. I said, hey, that sounds really interesting. And it was at the VA in Palo Alto, and then that was Gary Beaupre. And Gary said, look, you look like a pretty good match to the project. Let me talk with my colleague, Scott Delp. And it just so happened Scott and David Lloyd, who was my supervisor at the time, had done their postdocs together at the Rehab Institute of Chicago. So, this is unfortunately sometimes the way things work. There's a bit of a network, but that network really helped me in that case because David could really vouch for me. Scott knew what I'd been working on. I'd been in a conference, and within a week I had a postdoc at Stanford. Then I get a call from the NHMRC. Congratulations, you've got your award because someone didn't take it. And I said, oh, I'm sorry, I'm going to Stanford. And I've already committed, I'm taking this opportunity, but thanks anyway, I still put it on my CV. And so, yeah, I didn't give it much thought, I just said, let's go. And it wasn't until I arrived that the enormity of it all hit me, and I thought, crap, I know nothing about finite element modelling. These guys want me to make finite element models because now, I'd applied the same philosophy that I'd learned with David. Let's have some sort of model. Knee pain has to be caused by something, maybe it's stresses in the joint. That was the hypothesis. The stresses are due to this tissue, which is cartilage at the end of our joints. It goes into the bone, and this is where it becomes a bit of a dog's breakfast, because the stress in the cartilage is due to a whole bunch of different things. And then we've got to understand all of this, and oh my gosh, we're in the same kind of predicament. So anyway, thankfully, with the help of Gary Gold, who's an imaging expert, I learned how to do MR imaging. One of the nice things, of course, at Stanford is, I had my own scanner. We could go and book it out whenever I want. It's not quite like that at the moment, booking the scanner for research colleagues here. Unfortunately, it's pretty busy. But anyway, we did a whole bunch of research. There's a whole bunch of really great students who worked on this. I had a postdoc psychic who actually came here to the ABI and did a bit of work here as a visitor. We published a bunch of papers over 12 years, but at the end of it, I was thinking, you know what? Did we influence clinical practice? What have we done that's really changing the clinicians who are at the coalface? And I have to say, we probably have not changed clinical practice. It's unfortunate. We did a lot of interesting research, but we really need to be talking to people who are at the coalface. We were presenting our results to other like-minded individuals halfway around the world who said, yeah, that's great stuff, that's really good, but they're not the people we need to influence. So there's a take-home message here, and that's don't mistake your journal publications with clinical impact. You can have far more greater clinical impact by engaging with the people that you need to have an influence on. Okay, so along came this thing, validation and reproducibility. I'm not going to talk too much about this because I'm preaching to the converted here on this. And one thing I was very fortunate to be involved in was this thing called the Granny Challenge. And so this was still when I had my lab at Stanford. I'd started a human performance lab there. I was in the Department of Orthopedics, so I'd kind of transitioned from a postdoc and got a faculty position here. And I met BJ Fregley, and I'd known of his work, and he and Daryl DeLima, who was at the Scripps Clinic in San Diego, had designed an implant to go inside a patient, that's it here, and inside that implant was some load cells. So these people were walking around, there was 4 of them, and you could actually measure the forces inside the joint. We thought this is tremendous because we can now validate our models. We can say, let's predict the internal forces in the model, see how good we are. And what we decided to do was have a competition. Every year, for 5 years, we released some data, some new data that the scientific community hadn't seen, and we're going to see how close can you get. Well, it turns out we were horrible. We were awful. Our results were 50% off, 50% away from where they should have been. But that was okay, and I take my hat off to everyone who went into the competition because they really put their models on the line. But what happened is over 5 years is we got tighter and tighter and tighter. And so now we're 10 to 15%, which we think is actually pretty good. Again, there's been a really interesting thing from this. By making this open source and giving it to the community, there's a lot of people who have benefited from those data. And this is another take-home message, of course. Sharing models is good, sharing data even better. Okay, the knee hub, this is the new thing, and Ninka is working on this, doing her PhD on reproducibility. And here's a question: if you have the same data and you give it to 5 different world experts, we call ourselves experts, I've already told you I'm not an expert, but 5 different groups around the world, there's us and there's 4 people in the US, and you give them the same data, what results do you see? And it turns out you see, well, kind of different results. This is the art of modelling. And we're characterizing this and working with the FDA on this because computational models are being used more and more for testing clinical devices. So we see an important role here to try and understand this. So sharing data and models is absolutely necessary for the field to progress, and sharing data, again, can have much greater impact than publishing a paper. Hopefully you do both. That was again to my PhD students. Real-world measurement. Here's another model. This one is on fatigue fractures. Pretty common in running athletes and basketball athletes, where you get this cumulative stress in a tissue, this time bone, and stress becomes so great that you end up getting a fracture. And again, we've got some interesting model. We've got lots of different factors here. Ultimately, the stresses and the number of cycles together give rise to damage. That's pretty straightforward. Well, it turns out we're pretty good at making models. We can do that. Here's a tibia, and you can see some fancy colours. That's very nice. What we don't know is the number of cycles and the total cumulative life. We have no idea what patients or athletes are doing outside of the lab. They come in, they do their experiment, and then they hop and skip outside and they run along, they go to a gym session. Who knows what they're doing? Have no idea. So along comes real-world measurement. Okay, wearable sensors are now a feasible option for motion tracking outside the lab. How on earth do we integrate this information? So at this point, I decide to leave Stanford, and it's time to return home. So there's two little creatures in our life, which we'll get to at the very end, and there's also the omnipresent being that is Peter Hunter, who's kind of this magnet, right? He's drawing me back in. I didn't get there in the first step, but I ended up coming in the end, and he creates this position for myself, and just before that, Justin arrived as well, so it was this kind of joint appointment, if you like, of Justin and myself coming back to the ABI. And it was a fantastic time to then think about a group, right? There's this whole group of researchers, what do we want to do? And Vicky was there and instrumental in a lot of the work we were doing early on as well. I'm going to get to a bunch of these people. There's a whole, of course, group of PhD students that I've worked with, a bunch of them, of course, from the ABI, some Kelly's from AET, people who I've co-supervised since I've been back in New Zealand, as well as postdocs in the group, and as Peter said, we're a fairly large group now. Okay, so the take-home message here is surround yourself by good people and good things will happen. That's kind of a no-brainer, but it's actually quite important, and these guys make me look good. When I get up here and talk about all the things we've done, the collective we means them, because remember, I don't write code, apparently. All right, so here's a few solutions, some things we're working on. Hang in there, kids. I know Smika's already asleep. Just 15 more minutes, we'll wrap it up. Creating patient-specific models. I've already told you this takes a lot of time and effort. And so at the time at the ABI, there was a whole bunch of interesting tools about morphing models into shape and matching new geometry. I thought, this is really cool. How can we apply this to the musculoskeletal system? Well, of course, Justin had already done that for his PhD, but I wasn't seeing the results of it for the work. I had to go and do it all myself, painstakingly segmenting data and making models. So I thought, well, why don't we make a tool that can do this on a grand scale for lots of different people? And we got some funding from the FDA because they thought, hey, this is great. If you've got a tool that's open source and researchers all around the world can use that tool, you could do some interesting things. So we thought we'd make a bit of a client, which is a front-side kind of application. In the background, we've had a database, and then we can use this database, we can generate models, and we can share them with lots of different people. We were doing some modeling with the Stanford group and using their computational framework here. So we set this up. And I, like all good ideas, I stole the idea. And I stole it from the Cardiac Atlas project, which had come before me. And I just thought, the Musculoskeletal Atlas project just has a nicer ring to it, And it's kind of clever, right? Map. You guys get it? There's a map. Anyway. So that's what happened. This is really piggybacking on Ju Zhang's work. So Ju did his PhD, of course, at the ABI, and he created this population of bones. And this is from his PhD. We've got new PhDs. This is Salim's work with Jeff Hansfield, looking at the variation of muscles. And we've got a large data set we get from the Forensic Institute the Victorian Institute of Forensic Medicine in Melbourne. And we create lots of measures from these. We create statistical shape models to look at the variation across a population. And we also do some fun things where we can fit these models to really sparse data. And that's actually a really cool thing, and I think will have an impact here with this atlas. And we said we can use this, we can make it open source, and that's what we've done. And there's a whole bunch of people wanting to use it more than what we're doing. So there's another challenge, and that's getting material properties. And the only reason I put this in here, really, this is not my work, but the work of a group in Christchurch, and I'm sure many of you have heard of Mars Bioengineering, but I think this is the way of the future, and it's really exciting. I was there last week, I'm there again on Thursday. So hopefully, Mum, you can look after the kids again. But to look at multi-energy CT, you can now not only image the morphology of tissue, but you can get the constituents of the tissue. So you can measure potentially the proteoglycan content in this cartilage, which is really the function of the cartilage. This is functional imaging. And it's something that our research colleagues at Stanford, Gary Gold, has been wanting to do for a long, long time. And turns out a lot of New Zealanders solved this problem. And so we will be doing some of this work together actually with Marco Schneider early in the new year to do some imaging of joint health down in Christchurch. Just quickly, this is some work again of research colleagues transitioning away from representations of muscles that are kind of line segments to much more complicated fibre architecture. And again, I have to say, this is now borrowing from a lot of the work that's been done in the cardiac world. So thank you very much for that. And we're applying it to understand skeletal muscle. This is some of Vicky's work. The key thing here, again, is that we're trying to understand this complex form and function. And Vicky's done some nice work with David Lloyd. Again, this is now after David moved from UWA to Griffith University. And we got some ARC funding, and we did some research looking at Achilles tendon and tendinopathy. And what Vicky's showing here is that, well, from these tendon samples, and these were from another colleague actually in the States, from these tendon samples you can see stress distributions and potential rupture locations that are quite different across these different specimens. And indeed, when you start including some more complicated things like fascicle architecture, this is quite interesting. The Achilles tendon does a twist, like about 90-degree twist from the proximal to distal end. When you include that information, you see some differences in the stresses. And this is, although it's a bit of a very interesting point, it's also a bit of a bugger, because it says, well, okay, if you really want to understand soft tissue mechanics, you need to understand microstructure. And of course, the cardiac world knows this, and they've been doing this for a long time. And they'll say, Thor, you're an idiot, we knew that, we could have told you. Unfortunately, we now have to do this en masse in the clinic if we want to have an impact. And finally, the work, again, this is an extension of some of Vicky's work with the group in Griffith University, is doing statistical surrogates. And I saw this, actually, first Kumar did some of this work with Tim Wu, for those of you who might remember, in doing some facial animation. And I thought this is a fantastic tool to create a surrogate of your complicated finite element model and make it run pretty accurately but rapidly in a very short space of time. So now the predictions are pretty good compared to the complicated model, and you can do this in real time. So now we've got these studies doing real-time biofeedback of actual stresses and strains in the tissue as people are exercising. And so this is the future. This is what potentially will happen to you if you go, unfortunately, not strain your calf muscle and get injured and do some rehabilitation. This might be the future. Okay, so bear with me, we're almost through. Model complexity is sometimes necessary to capture mechanical behavior of tissue. And again, this is now the unknown unknowns. Turns out that we need to know this, so now we can talk to our friendly folk on the ground floor who are good at instrumentation, and we come up with ways of measuring. This is cool. There's also another bit of a problem here, and at what point do we simplify our models and generalize to a cohort of population? Because in the clinic, you'd like to say, well, this person meets this criteria, we're going to do a diagnosis, therefore they should have this intervention. And that's really hard to do because you need to measure all these things, you have to have models. So this is kind of the challenge we face. Can we simplify our models enough to get surrogates that tell us how to do these treatment interventions? Okay, so I'm going to finish with a couple of real-world applications. There are more than this that are going on in our group, so I apologise if I kind of missed out on some of your research. But nonetheless, they tell a couple of interesting stories. So we're going back to now this idea of fatigue fracture in runners. Here's kind of the model that we said. We don't have any idea about the loading, the number of cycles. So we thought, well, maybe we can measure this in the real world using wearable sensors. And so this was from Kelly Sheeran's PhD, which we've done with Denise Taylor and Reed at AUT. Turns out if you take a bunch of runners and they run at baseline, you can see quite a large variability in the impact accelerations that we're measuring at the tibia, even though they're running at the same speed. So again, we've got this problem. There's a cohort up here with really high impacts and a cohort with low impacts. But the idea is maybe if you give this feedback to an individual, they can reduce their loads, potentially change risk of injury. And that's what Kelly's done for his PhD, is ongoing and doing some further work in that. We went about doing this en masse, and this is where Mark Finch came along. Now, Mark had done his master's here at the ABI, when I first met him, I said, look, we've got to get this into the real world. I had some colleagues at the Institute of Sport in Australia, and the first thing we did was put them on swimmers, because Mark was a swimmer and he thought, let's do swimming research. And then iMeasureU was born, and we were lucky enough to win the Spark Challenge. As it was known then, we got some funding, and Mark started off on this journey, and I went with him as far as I could. Of course, I stayed within the nest. I said, you need to leave the nest, but I'm quite cosy here. So I'm going to stay at the ABI while you go out and risk everything, life and limb, to make this company work. Turns out it worked, but that's fine. It was a good reward for him, and he's now the CTO of Vicon, the company that bought it, so that's, good story. And of course, there's people in the room still working for iMeasureU, mostly ABI grads, but that's another good story. We collected a whole bunch of game data on the breakers. We've got 2 years worth of game data. This is all of the impact loads across an entire season. Good luck trying to analyse that. The take-home message here is that commercialisation is actually an important form of impact. We've created jobs for our graduates coming through. They're actually employed, and they're high-value jobs. That's pretty cool. We've got now NBA players wearing our sensors. That's an impact. That's hopefully going to reduce injuries and have an impact on the world. So sometimes commercialisation can be a good thing in terms of impact. And this is a study that's ongoing with colleagues at Harvard University, where we have measured impact load for an entire season. We can look at the loads across training and games. We can do some high-resolution imaging of bone, and we can do some bone remodeling to look at predicting fracture. And all of this can be done, of course, here in New Zealand, while all the data is being collected in the United States. So that's a pretty cool way of collaborating. And last but not least, in the area of orthopedics, I think our group has the potential to make some big changes, and we're seeing that already. And so Drew, again, from his PhD, extended that. We got an MB grant. We told MB that we'd create a company, and that's what we did. So Formus Labs was born, and that was 2017, I think, 2018. And so now, we're commercialising the work that happens from our research group in the real world. And so I think that's a really exciting phase to be in, where our work is actually clinically translated. It's also slightly scary, because along comes Paul Mark and says, hey, look guys, I love those models. We're gonna put this in some patients. How about we do that next week? And we start, okay, it might take a little bit longer than that. And this was from Musa Kazemi's PhD, and this is called high tibial osteotomy. You go and do a virtual surgery where you cut a wedge, you can see that, out of the tibia, and you reorient the joint to reduce the onset of later degeneration of the cartilage. Paul said, let's do it. I trust you guys. And we're going, oh, okay. But it turns out that without us, he's just going in and eyeballing it. So we say, okay, hand on heart, any information we can give you is better than just you going in there and eyeballing it. And so that's what we're doing. We're up to number 8 now. And it only takes a week instead of 3 months to turn this around. So hopefully that will speed up, and we can automate that process and potentially commercialise it through Formus Labs. Another fun story. So the take-home message here, it's good to be friendly with orthopaedic surgeons. Okay, a few things. What do we know that we didn't know before coming in here? It's okay to be a jack of all trades. Interesting research happens when you collaborate outside your sphere. So that's important to do that. And of course, the Auckland Bioengineering Institute is the great home to do this. Where else in the world would you be surrounded by people who have done a phys ed degree on one side and people who can actually write code on the other side? Ask good research questions. Surround yourself by good people. Research impact comes in all shapes and sizes, not just publication. And I think, again, this room and this audience is aware of that, the importance of sharing your data and sharing your models. Clinical translation takes time, but you can make it happen. Okay, when it's all said and done, really it's our whānau and friends that matter most in the journey here. So, of course, we're going to finish here with a few thank yous and a few notes. And I'm sorry if you don't appear here, I haven't put all my friends down. First and foremost, the parents. Of course, we wouldn't be here if it weren't for them. This is Dad doing some health and safety with the log splitter and with Mika, obviously. They had a good old giggle about that. Thankfully, she was safe at the end of that journey. But Joost and Jocelyn, of course, it's great that you're here. They've moved up from Tasman. Most people, when they retire, leave Auckland to go to Tasman. They've retired, they've left Tasman to come to Auckland, which is a great thing for us, of course, because now we have babysitters close by. But of course, all of the support you've given me over the years, particularly Mum, who was convincing me to do this physical education. I was interested in art and I wanted to do kind of graphic art and design. She said, "Oh, you like science and sport, maybe you should do that." And then the teachers in 7th form said, "No, he can't do that. He can't do both art and maths and physics at the same time." And well, I'm sorry to say it turns out I can, because my mother stormed into the principal's office that day and said, "No, he will do the 2 art subjects and maths and physics." So I appreciate that support, and of course, everything since taught me, to work hard, and that's important, because resilience, we all know you need to be resilient. So I'm so thankful that you could be here today. To the kids, of course, and I like this quote, no matter what life throws at you, at least you don't have ugly children. Frida gave me a card a couple of years ago and said that, so I appreciate that they take on their mother's looks and not their dad's looks. So thanks for being here. You guys are a continuous source of enjoyment and soon anxiety. My sister, who unfortunately could not be here, she's actually in quarantine, so she arrived unfortunately a little bit too late to be out of quarantine to be here today. But she's hopefully, touch wood, she fails her test. Again, this is just for people with COVID tests. That's the only test you want to fail. Hopefully they'll be out Sunday afternoon. So she and her whānau will be here, her 3 kids, and they're coming home for good. So this is exciting. This will be the first time in 20 years that we've had all the family together. So the one thing about Susie is she convinced me to do a PhD. She's, at the end of my honours, she said, "Well, what are you going to do now?" I said, "Well, I really like this research." She said, "Why don't you just go and study?" And so, of course, she'd already embarked on this journey. She has a PhD in astrophysics. And then, of course, thought it would be better to read books instead. So she had a career kind of editing books, and now she's got a job with the Reserve Bank of New Zealand. Funny. Anyway, but she told me that she actually shared some code with me as well, simplex algorithm that she was using to study pulsars and quasars and other ZARs things. But I used exactly the same code to calibrate my EMG-driven model. So I thank you for the code that she shared with me. And last but not least, to Sonia, who unfortunately for her really, in deciding to come to New Zealand, made probably the biggest sacrifice of all. So she was a very successful, still is, in my opinion, electrical engineer in Silicon Valley. But we had this decision, we said, look, we think it'd be good to be back home in New Zealand, and the kids with, the 2 kids at the time, pretty young. So we said, let's do it. So she really, I owe it to her that we could come here to New Zealand, and thank you for that. Now it's my turn. I've made it now, I'm a professor. So it's time, and the kids are at school, so it's role reversal time. So now you can go to work, and I'll be the stay-at-home dad. So with that, I'm going to finish, and thank you all for coming. It's so lovely to see so many people. I appreciate it all, and I look forward to many more years being at the Auckland Bioengineering Institute. Thank you very much.
So thank you, Thor, for a great talk, well, mostly a great talk, because a few of us will be talking to you tomorrow about cutting. But I think you will, the really dominant impression you will have got is that bioengineering research is a social activity, and you can have a lot of fun, and as well as doing great science. And we're very, very grateful to Sonia, especially, for making that decision to bring your family and Thor back to New Zealand. So thank you very, very much.